Welcome to this session on reasoning. In this session, we will take a look at syllogisms. In fact, we will take a look at some more questions based on the rule method. And we have seen that we use the rule method to solve syllogisms. Since this is a continuation of the same sessions on rule-based method, I recommend that you first watch the first two parts of this session and then come back here if you've not already watched them. In the previous session, we had summarized the three rules at the end of the session, and let us have those three rules once again here. Rule 1: for a conclusion to follow, the common term must be distributed at least in one of the two given statements. Rule number 2: nature of conclusion depends on if the conclusion is universal or particular, or affirmative or negative. If one of the statement is particular, then the conclusion should be particular, and if both the statements are particular, then no conclusion follows. Similarly, if one of the statements is negative, then the conclusion is negative, and if both the statements are negative, then no conclusion follows. And then we have rule 3, that if a term is distributed in the main statement, only then will it be distributed in the main conclusion. So these are our three rules which we will extensively apply to solve questions of syllogisms. So let us now solve a few questions based on this method. So the first question: all humans are mortal and all animals are mortal. What is the first step? The first step is to look for the common term. So we can see very easily that the common term in both the statements is the word mortal. So we have common term as mortal. What next? Let us apply our first rule. What does the first rule say? That common term must be distributed at least in one of the two given statements. So common term must be distributed. Let us look at the first question. All humans are mortal. What kind of a statement is this? This is a universal affirmative statement. And the subject is humans and the property is mortal. We know that in universal statement, only the subject is distributed. So definitely mortal is not distributed in the first statement. What about the second statement? All animals are mortal. Once again, this is also a universal affirmative statement. And because it's a universal statement, we know by the rule that subject is distributed. And what about the property? Property is not necessarily distributed, and moreover, in an affirmative statement, the property is not distributed. So mortal is definitely not distributed in statement 2 as well. So what does that mean? It means that the rule 1, which says that for a conclusion to follow, the common term must be distributed at least in one of the two given statements, has been violated. And because rule 1 has been violated, we can easily say that there is no conclusion that can follow from these two given statements. So let us go to another question. We have all ministers are politicians and no politicians are bureaucrats. And let us try to solve this question. So what is our first rule? Our first rule is look for the common term and check whether the common term is distributed in one of the two statements. So common term in our case is politicians because it is repeated in both the statements. In the first statement, which is a universal affirmative statement, politicians appears in the place of property, and therefore in the first statement politicians, the middle term is not distributed. But in the second statement, politicians, this is a universal negative statement, And in a universal negative statement, both the subject and the property are distributed. Since politicians appears as a subject, here politicians is distributed. So we can see that the first rule is obeyed. Now let us apply rule number 2. What does rule number 2 talk about? It talks about nature of conclusion. So in this case, we see that we have two universal statements. So therefore, the conclusion must be universal. And we have one affirmative and one negative statement. Therefore, the conclusion must be negative. So on the whole, we can say that conclusion should be universal negative. So what is the format of universal negative statement? The format of universal negative statement is no dash is dash, and both the dashes have to be filled with a subject and a property. Now let us apply rule number 3 here. And what does rule number 3 talk about? Rule number 3 talks about the remaining two terms. The remaining two terms are ministers and bureaucrats. I will write M for ministers and B for bureaucrats. So what do we see? Is ministers distributed in the first statement? In a universal affirmative statement, ministers is distributed. And in a universal negative statement, bureaucrats is also distributed. Now we know that in a universal negative statement, both the subject and the property are distributed. So we can write the conclusion as no minister is a bureaucrat. This also would have been correct. And we could have also written the other way around, no bureaucrat is a minister. This also would have been an accurate conclusion. So we can see these are the two given conclusions that follow from the statements given. So let us solve one more question. We have the statement all ministers are politicians, and another statement some ministers are actors. And let us solve now. Taking a look at the subject and the property. So ministers is the subject, politicians is the property. This is a universal affirmative statement. So ministers must be distributed and politicians must not be distributed. This is a particular affirmative statement. Ministers as the subject and actors as the property. Both the terms ministers and actors are not distributed. But what is rule number 1? Rule number 1 applies only to the common term. And what is our common term? Our common term is ministers. Now we can see that ministers is distributed in statement number 1. So I can say ministers is distributed in statement number 1. So rule number 1 follows. Rule number 2 talks about the nature of conclusion. And in this case, since one of the statement is universal and another is particular, the conclusion should be particular. And both the statements are affirmative. Therefore, the conclusion must be affirmative. So what can we say about the conclusion? The conclusion must be particular and affirmative. So what is the format of particular affirmative statements? So particular affirmative statements are of the form some dash are dash. And these two blank spaces will be filled with one of the two remaining terms. What are the two remaining terms? The two remaining terms are politicians and actors, and we can see none of these two terms are distributed. So we can write P for politicians and A for actors. So we can have this as some politicians are actors, and see, neither politicians nor actors in a particular affirmative statements will be distributed, because in particular affirmative statements neither the subject nor the property is distributed. And we could also have the conclusion as some actors are politicians. So both these conclusions would be valid conclusions for the given questions. With this, we come to an end of our session. If you wish to watch more videos, please log on to www.pfindia.com. If you wish to ask a query or a doubt, you can write to us at studentservices@pfindia.com. And if you're watching this video on our website, please use the Ask a Doubt feature to raise your queries. Thank you very much.